There are women who walk into a room and something shifts, not because they're beautiful, though they might be, not because they're loud or demanding attention, though they command it anyway. Something about them feels different, ancient, almost dangerous. People are drawn to them and afraid of them at the same time. Carl Jung spent decades studying these women, and what he discovered disturbed him so much that he issued a warning about their power that most people have never heard. Jung understood that some women carry what he called rare spiritual power, a psychological force so potent that it operates beyond ordinary consciousness, beyond social conventions, beyond the comfortable boundaries most people live within. These women aren't just intuitive or empathetic. They're something else entirely. They see what others can't see, know what others can't know, and carry a presence that makes the unconscious visible. Today, we're going to explore 7 hidden signs of women with this rare spiritual power and why Jung warned that their energy walks a dangerous line between transformation and destruction, between healing and chaos, between light and an unsettling darkness that most people refuse to acknowledge. If you've ever felt fundamentally different from other women, if you've been called too intense or too much, if you carry an inner knowing that you can't explain and a power you don't fully understand, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because what we're about to explore will help you understand why Jung saw women like you as both gift and warning to the world. The first hidden sign Jung identified is what he called the sight, an ability to perceive the unconscious content of others with disturbing accuracy. These women don't just read body language or pick up on social cues. They see directly into the shadow, into the parts people hide from themselves, into the truth beneath every mask and performance. When you meet them, you feel exposed, even if they say nothing. Jung documented this phenomenon extensively in his clinical work. He encountered women who could describe his patients' dreams without being told, who knew family secrets that had been buried for generations, who perceived the exact nature of psychological complexes before any analysis began. This wasn't psychic ability in the supernatural sense. Jung understood it as an extraordinarily developed intuitive function combined with direct access to what he called the collective unconscious. These women make people uncomfortable because they reveal what others work hard to conceal. They don't need you to tell them your story. They can feel the shape of your wounds, the nature of your defenses, the truth you're avoiding. This sight isn't something they can turn off. It's always operating, always perceiving layers that most people never access. And it isolates them because most relationships can't survive that level of transparency. The second hidden sign is what Jung termed shadow sovereignty. These women have not only confronted their own darkness, they've integrated it and learned to work with it consciously. Most people spend their lives running from their shadow, projecting it onto others, or being unconsciously possessed by it. But women with rare spiritual power have descended into their depths, faced what they found there, and emerged with something most people fear: the to hold both light and darkness without being destroyed by either. Jung warned that this shadow integration makes these women unpredictable and potentially dangerous, not because they're evil, but because they've transcended the simple, moral categories most people use to feel safe. They understand that rage can be sacred, that destruction can be necessary, that what society calls darkness often contains the exact medicine a situation requires. They don't perform goodness or niceness. They operate from a deeper ethics that doesn't always look acceptable on the surface. This is why spiritually powerful women are often misunderstood, ostracized, or labeled as witches bitches, or dangerous. They refuse to split themselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts. They've claimed all of themselves, the kind and the cruel, the nurturing and the destroying, the healer and the one who knows when healing means letting things die. Jung observed that this wholeness terrifies people still trapped in their own internal division. The third sign Jung identified is the carrier function. These women unconsciously carry psychological content for the collective. Jung called them psychopomps, guides between worlds, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between the individual and the collective psyche. They absorb the unprocessed trauma, the denied emotions, the rejected truths of everyone around them. Not by choice, but by the nature of their psychological structure. This is both their power and their burden. They feel what others refuse to feel. They know what others refuse to know. They carry what others refuse to carry. Jung documented how these women would become physically ill when holding too much collective shadow, how they'd experience inexplicable depression that wasn't theirs, how they'd dream other people's dreams and feel other people's pain in their own bodies. The danger Jung warned about is that if these women don't understand what's happening, if they don't learn to differentiate between their own psychological content and what they're carrying for others, they can be destroyed by it. They become scapegoats, identified with the darkness they're holding, blamed for the very shadow material the collective refuses to acknowledge. This is the psychological mechanism behind witch hunts, behind the persecution of powerful women throughout history. The fourth hidden sign is what Jung called archetypal activation. These women don't just embody one archetypal pattern, they channel multiple archetypes depending on what the moment requires. They can be the nurturing mother, the fierce warrior, the seductive lover, the wise crone, the innocent maiden, the destructive goddess, all within the same day, sometimes within the same hour. This fluidity makes them magnetic and unsettling. People don't know which version of them they're going to encounter, which face the woman will wear, which energy will be present. Jung understood this as a sign of extraordinary psychological flexibility, but also as something that could overwhelm both the woman herself and everyone around her if not properly integrated. Most people identify with one or two archetypal patterns and spend their lives living within those narrow confines. But women with rare spiritual power are archetypal shapeshifters. They don't have a fixed identity because they're connected to something deeper than personality. They're connected to the collective patterns that live in the unconscious of humanity itself. Jung warned that this connection could lead to what he called psychic inflation, if the woman identifies with the archetypes rather than recognizing herself as a channel for them. The fifth sign is perhaps the most disturbing: the death perception, an ability to sense when death is near, not just physical death, but psychological death, the death of relationships, the death of identities, the death of old ways of being. These women can feel when something is ending long before anyone else recognizes it. They know when a relationship is over while their partner is still planning the future. They sense when someone is dying while doctors are declaring them stable. Jung encountered this phenomenon repeatedly in his work with intuitive women. They would report knowing the exact moment a loved one died despite being miles away. They would dream of deaths before they occurred. They would feel the presence of what Jung called the death archetype, moving through situations, relationships, and individuals. This wasn't morbid fascination with death. It was direct perception of the death-rebirth cycle that operates beneath the surface of all life. This perception isolates these women profoundly because they're always aware of the impermanence others are desperately trying to ignore. They can't invest in illusions of permanence. They can't pretend that what's dying isn't dying. They can't comfort others with false hope when they know the truth. Jung warned that this knowledge creates a loneliness so deep that these women often question their own sanity. The sixth hidden sign Jung identified is the void tolerance, the ability to sit in emptiness, in not knowing, in the space between death and rebirth without needing to fill it with meaning or action or distraction. Most people cannot tolerate the void. They need constant stimulation, constant reassurance, constant proof that life has meaning and they have purpose. But women with rare spiritual power can descend into the void and remain there, waiting, listening, allowing whatever needs to emerge in its own time. Jung called this holding the tension of the opposites, the capacity to remain present in the space where nothing makes sense, where all familiar structures have dissolved, where the old hasn't quite died and the new hasn't quite been born. This is where transformation actually happens, in the void that most people flee from. These women don't flee. They've learned to trust the emptiness, to recognize it as the womb of creation rather than the grave of meaning. But this tolerance comes at a cost. These women often appear to others as detached, cold, or emotionally unavailable when they're actually holding a depth that most people can't comprehend. They're not running from feeling. They're sitting in a feeling so profound that it transcends the personal emotions most people identify with. Jung understood that this void tolerance is essential for genuine transformation, but it also marks these women as fundamentally different from those who need constant external validation and distraction. The seventh and final sign is what Jung called the serpent wisdom, a knowledge that comes not from books or teachers or conventional learning, but directly from the unconscious itself. This is the ancient knowing that cultures once associated with oracles, priestesses, and wise women. It's not intellectual understanding. It's embodied gnosis, a knowing that lives in the body, in the dreams, in the visions that arise unbidden from the depths. Jung was fascinated and deeply unsettled by women who possessed this serpent wisdom. They would speak truths that couldn't be explained by their education or experience. They would offer insights that seemed to come from a source beyond personal consciousness. They would know things about history, about symbols, about psychological dynamics that they'd never been taught. Jung attributed this to what he called direct access to the collective unconscious, a permeability between the personal psyche and the vast reservoir of human experience and knowledge. This serpent wisdom is why these women have been feared, persecuted, and silenced throughout history. They know too much. They see too clearly. They speak truths that threaten the comfortable lies society depends on. Jung warned that women carrying this wisdom face a particular danger. They will be either worshipped or destroyed, placed on pedestals as divine or burned as demonic, but rarely allowed to exist as simply human. These seven signs, the sight, shadow sovereignty, the carrier function, archetypal activation, death perception, void tolerance, and serpent wisdom, create a psychological profile of women who operate outside normal consciousness. Jung warned that these women walk a razor's edge between transformation and destruction, between serving as medicine for the collective and being poisoned by what they carry. The danger, as Jung saw it, wasn't the power itself, but what happens when these women don't understand what they are, when they're isolated and unsupported, when they're pathologized by a culture that fears the very gifts they embody. Without proper understanding and integration, these women can be consumed by the forces they carry. They can fragment under the weight of what they perceive and feel. They can lose themselves in the archetypal energies that move through them. But when these women understand their nature, when they learn to work consciously with their power rather than being possessed by it, when they find others who can recognize and support what they are. They become extraordinary forces for transformation. Not comfortable transformation, not safe healing, but the kind of deep psychological and spiritual work that actually changes things at the root level. Jung's dark warning wasn't about the women themselves. It was about what happens to them in a world that hasn't evolved enough to hold their power. He saw how society crushes these women through isolation, through pathologizing their gifts as mental illness, through forcing them into conventional roles that suffocate their nature, through making them doubt their own perception until they become disconnected from the very source of their power. He also warned about what happens when these women misunderstand their power, when they identify with it rather than serving as a conscious vessel for it. When a woman with rare spiritual power believes she is the goddess rather than someone the goddess moves through, when she claims divine authority over others, when she uses her perception to manipulate rather than illuminate, that's when the power becomes genuinely dangerous. If you've recognized yourself in these 7 signs, if you're one of these women carrying rare spiritual power, subscribe to this channel because we explore the depths of Jung's wisdom about feminine psychology, spiritual power, and the journey of integration. Understanding what you are is the first step toward working with your gifts consciously, rather than being overwhelmed by them. The question Jung would pose to women with this power is simple but profound. Will you let it destroy you, or will you learn to channel it consciously? Will you be consumed by what you perceive and carry, or will you develop the psychological strength to hold it without fragmenting? Will you use your sight to judge and condemn, or to witness and transform? Will you let the shadow you've integrated possess you, or will you work with it as a conscious ally? Jung believed that humanity desperately needs women with rare spiritual power, especially in times of collective crisis and transformation. These women can see what others can't see, feel what others refuse to feel, and guide consciousness into territories that terrify most people. But they can only serve this function if they survive their own power, if they find support and understanding, if they learn to differentiate between personal content and what they're carrying for the collective. The rarity of these women isn't about superiority. It's about psychological structure, about the particular way their psyche is organized that allows direct access to layers of consciousness most people never touch. Jung observed that these women are often born into difficult circumstances, marked by early trauma or extraordinary sensitivity that forces them to develop unusual psychological capacities as survival mechanisms. Their power isn't a gift in the comfortable sense. It's often experienced as a burden, a curse, an unwanted responsibility. These women didn't choose their sight, their sensitivity, their connection to the unconscious. It chose them. And once activated, it can't be turned off or returned. The only choice is whether to work with it consciously or be overwhelmed by it unconsciously. What Jung ultimately wanted people to understand is that women with rare spiritual power are not supernatural beings. They're human women with extraordinary psychological capacities operating within a culture that has lost its ability to recognize, honor, and support such gifts. They walk between worlds, not because they're special, but because their psyche is structured in a way that makes the veil between consciousness and unconsciousness more permeable. They are reminders of what humanity has forgotten, that there are depths to consciousness beyond the rational mind, that perception extends beyond the physical senses, that power exists in dimensions most people never access.